So let's shift focus to personal finance. It's always tempting to get carried away by stocks, but ultimately personal finance reminds you that you have so many other considerations to think of. Today we stick to stocks, but in a sense through the mutual fund route. Hemant Rustagi of Wiseinvest Advisors is with us. Hemant, the question to you really is, how much relevance do sector or thematic funds hold at all for the retail sector, retail investors, in any market condition, including the current market conditions? Would it make more sense to give complete freedom to the fund manager and therefore prefer balanced funds, or just an equity fund like, the top 200 and HDFC Prudence, where the fund manager has complete equity freedom, or in a balanced fund where he has, equity to debt freedom? Or should you prefer these thematic funds where sometimes you can get very dramatic gains? Like Sonia was pointing out, if someone had put in a real estate fund, say a year ago, they would be sitting in a gold mine.
Well, I agree with you completely. One of the best things about investing in mutual fund is that mutual funds offer a variety of funds, in each asset class. For example, if you look at equity as an asset class, there are a whole lot of funds that are available. As you mentioned, there are diversified funds, there are funds that, focus on each segment of the market, large cap, mid cap, and small cap, and there are thematic and sector funds. That is what we're going to discuss now. So each investor, whosoever wants to take exposure to or invest in mutual funds has, a lot of options to invest in. But if you talk about these two variety of funds, the sector fund, to my mind, I think can be described as intermediate between investing in stocks of a sector and a diversified fund. Whereas if you look at a thematic fund, it basically invests in funds that fit into a theme but could be across multiple sectors. So my view is that a sector fund is good for an experienced investor who understands the sector, both in terms of what the potential is, what the risks are, and it seeks diversification in that sector. So in a way, I think a sector fund can lend support to a diversified portfolio by allowing investor to increase exposure to those sectors that have underrepresentation in a particular portfolio. But the fact remains that for a sector fund, the investment universe is quite narrow, so they can be quite risky and quite volatile. So investors need to be very careful while investing in them, both in terms of whether they should be investing in them at all, whether they have the risk profile to actually invest in these, and also if they invest, how much they should be investing. And also I think the selection of sector is very, very important. On the other hand, if you look at thematic fund, they basically follow, as far as the thematic funds, they are broad, more diversified, as compared to a sector fund. So what they're looking for, the trend, which can, result in outperformance of some sectors or certain stock. So, but the problem there is that, the flip side there is that, the theme, if it does not materialize, or the market takes more time to realize the potential of the theme, which becomes the basis of launching a thematic fund, there can be prolonged period of underperformance. So both these categories have the potential to do well, but as I mentioned earlier, I think they can be quite risky, so investors need to be very, very careful before investing in them. And also, I believe that even if an experienced investor wants to invest in these funds, he should not be investing more than 10 to 15%, or ideally maybe 10% of the portfolio. As far as the retail investors are concerned, it's quite evident that these funds are not ideally suited to them. They also need to realize that, all this diversified fund which have a consistent performance track record invariably would be investing in those sectors and themes that have potential to do well. But that's why they are able to perform well over a period of time. But we have seen time and again retail investor jumping into these funds, especially when the markets are doing well. So I think they need to be very careful that they should not be investing very aggressively in these funds, if at all. My view is a well diversified portfolio takes care of needs of especially the retail investor, because if the objective is to build corpus over a period of time, the focus should be on diversified fund and not so much in aggressive funds.
Yeah, that's some really sane advice actually. Just 10 to 15% exposure in some of these thematic funds is a good thing to do. Of course, the risk reward is extremely high. But Hemant, we have a caller who's joining in, so let's get him in on his query as well. Sudhir Bansal calls in from Gurgaon. Hi Sudhir, tell us what your question is and what your risk profile is as well.
Okay, my name is Sudhir Bansal from Gurgaon. I am 54 years of age. I am a professional. I am a little confused, like we measure the performance of an equity mutual fund against its peers or benchmark index. What is the measure of performance of a thematic fund? What part allocation should be made? This you have already said, or should I be avoided altogether? This part, of course, you have already given, but can I have some load information on this?
Okay. So, Hemant, you've told him about how much he should be allocating to, some of these thematic funds. But he also wants to know, suppose we're starting the year now. If you look back, then you can measure saying that, real estate has done well, banks have done well, autos have done well. So, perhaps those themes have worked. But how do you measure the start of the year? What kind of themes or what sectors would do well and allocated thereabout?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, thematic funds, if you really were to compare with them with the sector fund, they are more diversified. But if you compare them with diversified fund, obviously they are more aggressive because, as I mentioned earlier, that these funds look for a trend that can result in outperformance. So I think it's clearly an issue of an investor knowing basically what his risk profile is. As I mentioned earlier, some percentage of the portfolio can be invested in that. But I think if you look at the benchmarking of these, for example, sector fund, you have a benchmark clearly, so you can see whether the fund has done well or not. But if you look at these, thematic funds, even though like a diversified fund and sector fund, they also have a benchmark. But considering that there are a variety of thematic funds which are available in the market, some of them are broad-based, like you have these infrastructure funds. And then there are some funds which have very narrow investment universe. So I think it clearly depends on what is the risk profile of an investor. And also, I think somewhere, as I mentioned earlier, it's only the experienced investor who should be investing in them. So once you have become an experienced investor in equity,
Hemant,
you have some idea.
I think what Mr. Bansal is asking us is, how, whether those benchmarks are good. For instance, you put in an infrastructure fund. I don't know if there is an infrastructure index at all. There is a BSE PSU index. There is a BSE capital goods index. But it may not be exactly an infrastructure index. So when these funds, sector funds are announced, do they give their benchmarks as well?
Well, many sector funds, of course, most of the sector funds have their own index. But in terms of, if you look at thematic funds, as you rightly mentioned, I think there is no, most of these infrastructure funds are basically having Nifty 50 or Sensex or BSE 100 as a benchmark. And the reason for that is that these are basically quite broad-based. They are very different from infrastructure stocks when we talk about. They are quite broad-based. So I think because the theme over there is to invest in the companies that can be instrumental in improving the infrastructure in the country and also which can benefit from the infrastructure growth in the country. So there, it's a broad-based basically index which is there. But I think most of the other thematic funds that you see, I think there are relevant benchmarks. But the only problem is in those, because they're unique in nature, you cannot really compare them with peer group because there may not be too many examples over there. Whereas in case of infrastructure, because there are a whole lot of infrastructure funds, you can actually look at a comparison with the peer group, but not in every thematic fund.
Fair enough. Thanks a lot, Hemant, for joining us and taking our viewer questions. So the key takeaways, get into thematic or even sector funds only if you are a very savvy investor, and even then, not more than 10% of your equity investments in that. It's better to get into perhaps funds where the fund manager has more freedom to move from one theme to another, from one sector to another, depending on the economic cycle. Also, remember to join us